Sir, I believe the jungle just flipped us off. General Clorn's voice crackled through the comms as the dense green canopy above their hovercraft shifted, rearranged itself, and unmistakably formed a rude gesture using its largest branches. His squad laughed nervously. Then one of them screamed, short and sharp, before vanishing upward in a tangle of vines. In the silence that followed, only the sound of leaves rustling and something breathing, remained. General Threx clicked his mandibles in annoyance and muttered, "Primitive planets. Always trying too hard to be scary." Behind him, the vines formed a face. It smiled. 3 days earlier, Earth had been declared a Category 9 abandonment zone, officially listed on the Galactic Expansion Register as inhospitable, overgrown, and culturally irrelevant. Perfect, according to the League of Planetary Generals, for establishing a hidden forward base on the galactic frontier. Rich in oxygen, unmonitored, and best of all, cheap. The generals were eager. Earth was, after all, a planet that had surrendered its own ecosystems to chaos centuries ago. Its human population had scattered to orbital colonies, terraformed moons, and indoor citadels. Only the ruins remained, cracked concrete, rusted skeletons of civilization, and beneath it all, an overgrowth so thick it had swallowed cities whole. Alien hovercrafts, shimmering like beetle shells dipped in chrome, sliced through the clouds over Earth's equator. Inside them, the most pompous, entitled, and tactically decorated beings in the galaxy smirked and sipped nutrient wine. General Sortal of the Arkan Dominion leaned over a glass panel, sneering at the thick jungle below. "They called this the Amazon? I've seen more threat in a hydroponic salad bar." Beside him, General Vortex adjusted his ornamental shoulder plates and nodded. "According to local archives, the climate here became too unstable for human habitation." "How adorable!" Plants scared them off. A burst of static interrupted their sarcasm. The lead recon drone sent into Sector 8, the heart of the Amazonian resurgence, vanished. One moment it was mapping terrain, the next, the feed cut to black with a single frame of something, green and humanoid, watching the camera from behind a wall of bark. They reviewed the image. Zoomed. Analyzed. Laughed. "Camouflage enthusiast," Clorn said, sipping from a thermos labeled earth juice, in Sharpe. "Probably some leftover biotech experiment. Send in Squad Zeta. Burn it down if it moves." Squad Zeta never returned. On the surface, at the edge of a broken highway being overtaken by roots, the generals assembled for their first tour of the so-called wild zones. A human scientist, Dr. Nevin Brooks, shuffled nervously behind them, shackled in alien cuffs, a breathing collar locked around his neck. He had been taken from a lunar lab to serve as Earth Liaison, a fancy title that meant, "the guy we blame if things go wrong." "They warned you," Nevin muttered under his breath as they passed the crumbled bus stop overrun with fluorescent mushrooms. "They begged you not to come here. We told you the forest changed." Clorn snorted. Yes, everything mutated. Plants got feelings. Trees evolved legs. Please. You're just jealous we're turning this moss pit into a fortress." Then the forest moved. Not swayed. Not rustled. Moved. The entire tree line shifted forward, like it had collectively taken a breath. The generals paused. The air thickened. A wet, fungal smell wafted through the clearing. General Threx broke the silence. "Probably a weather system." Then the moss whispered. It wasn't a breeze or wind, it was language. In a dozen voices, some ancient, some childlike, all wrong. And through the whisper, a phrase repeated itself. "Return what you stole." The generals exchanged glances. Nevin took a step back. "Yeah," he whispered. "This is the part where you run." Instead, the generals called in heavy support, mechanized war beasts, terrain-scorching drones, and ground-thumper artillery. They set up perimeters, laughed at the mossy landscape, and set their weapons to cleanse. The cleansing lasted 6 minutes. One by one, their weapons jammed. Drones dropped from the sky, covered in bright red spores. One war beast turned on its operators, covered in bioluminescent vines that had somehow hijacked its programming. The forest retaliated with precision, branches snapping like whips, roots coiling around power cores and detonating them from below. It was organized. It was intentional. Then they saw her. At the center of the chaos, emerging from the veil of green mist and leaf shadow, stood a figure. 7 feet tall, humanoid in form but made entirely of twisting vines, bark, and glowing chlorophyll. Her face, if it could be called that, was a blend of soft petals and ancient bark, eyes like twin emerald suns. She stepped silently, the forest bending around her, obeying. The Reaper had come. Nevin dropped to his knees. Not from fear, but reverence. She was real, he whispered. Project Verdant was real. Sortau raised his plasma rifle. You! Stand down and identify yourself. The Reaper tilted her head. The air grew colder. Or maybe wetter. Her voice, when it came, was the sound of 1,000 leaves rustling at once. You mock what you cannot understand. You desecrate what you abandoned. You bring fire to what breathes. Now I return the favor. A wall of thorns erupted behind her, impaling 3 nearby guards mid-joke. Screams followed, some cut short, some drawn out like threads through a loom of pain. The generals fled. Back at the makeshift base, command was in shambles. Maps distorted. Weather behaved like it was following orders from something else. Bio-readings showed intelligence patterns throughout the flora. The jungle wasn't alive. It was aware. Clorn pounded the console. What kind of creature is she? Nevin, now free of his collar, stared at the green shapes on the screen and said, Not a creature. A consequence. By nightfall, the perimeter was gone. Communication lines were overrun by moss, their messages repeating distorted signals that sounded increasingly like laughter. In the distance, the jungle glowed with a strange light, part aurora, part wildfire, entirely unnatural. The Reaper walked among it, her form shifting with the canopy. She was no longer just in the jungle. She was the jungle. And the jungle wanted its planet back. The generals regrouped at Outpost Theta, the only structure left standing after the first onslaught. It was a fortress by design, hover-shielded, armed with kinetic cannons, and surrounded by thermal mines. Yet the vines were already at its walls, testing, probing, curling through microscopic cracks like intelligent fingers. Inside, the mood had shifted from arrogance to agitated denial. They couldn't agree if what they'd seen was real, or the result of some hallucinogenic spores. General Sortau refused to believe a sentient forest was resisting them. He insisted it was a rogue bioweapon or leftover human tech. General Threx, however, had gone strangely quiet since witnessing the Reaper. He stood by the window, eyes wide, whispering under his breath. She didn't walk, she flowed. Across the wild zones, the counterattack had already begun. The Reaper, now fully awakened, no longer relied on surprise. She moved with deliberate wrath, activating parts of the planet long thought dormant. In the mirewood swamps, her spores reanimated ancient root systems, creating lurching mounds of mud and vines with vaguely human forms. They moved slow, but when they caught a target, it was like watching the earth itself swallow a scream. In the screaming roots forest, the trees amplified sound into devastating shockwaves. An alien patrol's laughter triggered a sonic boom that flattened an entire hill and left only pulped armor behind. The Reaper wasn't just fighting. She was coordinating. Every wild zone had once been isolated, a quarantine perimeter designed by the last human governments to contain biological anomalies. But she had connected them. Somehow, across thousands of miles, the biomes were syncing, communicating. What had been wild, chaotic nature was now an organized ecosystem of war. It wasn't just a jungle anymore. It was strategy. It was command. It was revenge. The generals, realizing brute force was ineffective, deployed the Harvest Protocol, a direct incursion using biomech suits designed to adapt to planetary conditions. The suits were advanced, capable of filtering toxins, resisting corrosive spores, and even syncing with the user's nervous system to respond in real time. A dozen elite soldiers were dropped into the thick of Sector 9, armed and confident. Within 10 minutes, their suit feeds began broadcasting strange visual data. Trees bending away, only to suddenly snap back like loaded traps. Foliage that changed color when observed. One soldier's feed showed his teammates grinning at him with vines growing out of their helmets before the screen went black. Only one came back. Barely alive, dragged into outpost theta by a fungal deer with glowing eyes. His armor had fused with his skin. His voice had changed pitch, and when asked what happened, he smiled and whispered, "She sings through the roots now. We just didn't know how to listen." He then began vomiting spores and had to be incinerated on the spot. Meanwhile, Nevin Brooks had become something of an enigma to the aliens. They couldn't understand why he wasn't afraid. He walked the outpost corridors calmly, even as the forest crept closer. When questioned, he gave short, sarcastic answers and stared too long at the trees. The truth was, Nevin had been part of the original Verdant project team. He had watched Dr. Nia Rowe, the woman who would become the Reaper, undergo the transformation. He had begged the Council not to proceed. She had volunteered to protect Earth, to merge with the biome, become a living failsafe. And then they abandoned her. All of them. Left her in the dirt, while they ran to the stars. Now she was awake again, and Nevin didn't know whether to feel guilt or awe. Inside the command center, tension boiled over. The generals argued. Sortal demanded orbital strikes. Threx said orbital strikes hadn't worked on the Red Moon riots, and wouldn't work on a living planet. Vortix proposed diplomatic outreach, which Clorn mocked until Vortix nearly shot him with a spore gun he'd stolen from a fallen trooper. The only agreement among them was that they were running out of time. The jungle was at their door. Literally. Roots were now visible in the air vents. In desperation, they sent an emissary. A hover drone, white-flagged, carrying a projection unit and a formal offer to negotiate peace terms. It didn't get far. A kilometer out from the base, the drone was snared midair by a vine, drawn down, and cracked open like a fruit. From its shattered remains, a new figure emerged, tall, twisted, and wearing a grotesque approximation of a general's uniform made of leaves, bones, and fragments of alien armor. The forest had answered their offer with a puppet. The puppet spoke in a dozen voices, all at once, repeating a simple phrase. "You were warned. You did not listen. Now you breathe what you buried." The message ended with the puppet collapsing into a pile of roaches and roots that skittered away like laughter. That night, the Reaper moved into the open. Her silhouette towered in the distance, framed by bioluminescent clouds and lightning. She raised one arm, and the ground quaked. From beneath Outpost Theta, long-buried roots surged upward, piercing the energy shields and tearing through steel. The aliens opened fire. Plasma lit up the sky, scorching trees, evaporating pools. But the Reaper kept coming. She didn't dodge. She didn't flinch. The vines healed her as fast as she was damaged. And then, with a flick of her hand, the forest retaliated. One general, Clorn, was impaled by a tree branch that sprouted directly from the floor beneath him. Threx was dragged screaming into the walls, his voice swallowed by bark that grew over his mouth mid-cry. Sortal escaped, but not before witnessing the Reaper's face up close. Behind the bark and vines, he saw her eyes, human eyes. Nia's eyes. Filled with fury, but also sorrow. For a moment, he saw not a monster, but a woman broken by abandonment, rebuilt by rage. Nevin approached her as the base collapsed, hands raised. She didn't attack. Instead, the vines around her paused, awaiting her command. He whispered, "Nia, is there anything left of you?" The Reaper touched his forehead gently. A memory flowed into him, her final day as a scientist, the pain of transformation, the silence that followed, the betrayal of being left behind. And one last emotion, hope. Faint, buried deep, but real. She turned from him and walked into the dark, the forest closing behind her like a curtain. The battle was not over. It had just begun. She had tested their strength, gauged their cruelty. Now she would show them what a world truly looked like when it decided to fight back. General Sortal stumbled through the skeletal remains of Outpost Theta, his polished armor streaked with mud and sap, his pride clinging to him like a tattered flag. The air around him vibrated with strange frequencies, birdsong mixed with metallic echoes, laughter warped by the wind. He could no longer tell where the jungle ended and madness began. The once imposing command center was now draped in vines, pulsing with green light, as if the planet itself had digested it and was still chewing. Everything reeked of rebirth and rot, like something ancient had woken up hungry. Inside what remained of the war room, General Vortex paced in frantic circles, muttering to himself while trying to recalibrate a damaged communication array. His fingers twitched, raw from clawing moss off the panels. "This is salvageable," he whispered. "If we can call down an orbital pulse cannon, we can sterilize the entire zone." Nevin stood nearby, arms crossed, watching him the way one watches a child building a sandcastle during high tide. "You're still trying to send messages out? Didn't you hear? The satellites are gone. Grown over. The forest climbed into orbit." Vortex laughed, dry and sharp. "Nonsense. That's not even biomechanically feasible." Nevin raised an eyebrow and pointed at the wall, where a living map now pulsed, a detailed topographical display of the region, made entirely out of moss and glowing fungal threads. It updated in real time. "She's thinking in ways you can't fathom," Nevin said. "She doesn't need tech. She is the network now." Vortex's eye twitched. Then he picked up a plasma torch and swung it at the wall in a fury. The moss recoiled with a hiss. A moment later, a root lashed through the floor and wrapped around his leg, dragging him screaming into the biomass. He didn't even get to finish the scream before the floor sealed up behind him, smooth as bark. Outside, the jungle was no longer hiding. It was marching. Trees with legs uprooted themselves and moved like slow titans across the field. Insect swarms formed symbols in the air, warnings, glyphs, or taunts, no one knew. Animals that no longer resembled their former species roamed the ruins, their eyes glowing with the same emerald light as the Reaper. A new kind of order had formed in the chaos, one governed not by laws or logic, but by rhythm and root, decay and bloom. The planet had not gone wild. It had evolved. General Threx had gone completely silent, sitting alone in a chamber overtaken by ivy. He no longer responded to hails. When Nevin checked on him, he found the general surrounded by carvings, symbols etched into the walls using fingernails and blood. The markings were identical to those seen in the earliest cave dwellings on Earth, only here they were overgrown with small flowers that grew faster when touched. Threx spoke finally, softly, as if in prayer. "She showed me," he said. "She showed me what we did to her, what we did to Earth. She isn't punishing us. She's remembering us." Nevin left him there. He didn't try to reason with it. He had begun to understand that this wasn't just revenge. It was resurrection. The Reaper wasn't acting as a weapon anymore. She had become something more fundamental. A planetary immune system, calibrated not to protect life as it was, but to purge the infection of those who had betrayed it. Elsewhere in the jungle, deep beneath the roots of what had once been Sao Paulo, a hidden lab remained untouched by the invasion. It was here that General Sortal made his last desperate gamble. Inside the vault was a contingency plan, Project Chlorosis, a kill switch encoded into the original Reaper genome. If activated, it would disrupt the neural web binding the bionetwork, severing the Reaper's consciousness from her body. He didn't know if it would kill her, but it would at least cripple her long enough to deploy an extraction team. The lab, cold and clinical, was a relic from Earth's final days. Screens flickered with old footage of Nia Rowe, smiling nervously into the camera as she described her willingness to sacrifice herself for the planet. Sortal didn't see a hero. He saw a weapon left half-finished. He activated the switch. For a moment, the world stopped. The vines stopped growing. The roots froze. The wind held its breath. Then came a scream, not one sound, but many layered on top of each other. It came from the soil, from the trees, from every leaf that had ever touched sunlight. And in that scream was betrayal. The jungle shuddered. Then everything exploded into motion. The forest convulsed like a wounded animal, lashing out in all directions. But instead of retreating, the Reaper changed. Nevin felt it in his bones first. A pressure in the air, like gravity, had tilted. The Reaper's presence, once distant and elemental, was now immediate, pressing against the skin. Then she emerged, not as a figure of bark and vine, but as something else entirely. Translucent, glowing, unbound by a body. A spirit of chlorophyll and fury. The kill switch hadn't killed her. It had freed her. She was no longer a woman made of plants. She was the forest soul. Sortal tried to run. The lab collapsed behind him. Roots chased him like wolves, snapping through walls and floors. His escape pod launched half-melted, its trajectory slingshot by the jungle's magnetic storms. For a moment, it looked like he might escape. Then a single vine punched through the pod's cockpit window. It didn't strangle him. It gently placed a seed in his mouth and left him drifting in orbit, watching Earth glow green from space. Back on the ground, the rest of the alien forces disintegrated into chaos. Orders meant nothing. Units vanished without trace. And yet, there were no mass casualties, no piles of corpses. The Reaper wasn't executing them. She was erasing them. When the spores entered your lungs, you stopped being you. You became part of the whole. Nevin stood in the ruins of Theta, surrounded by silence. There were no screams anymore, no gunfire, no roars of machines. Just the hum of life returning to balance. He walked to the edge of the overgrowth and waited. And eventually she came. The Reaper stood before him, her form shifting gently like a flame in wind. There were human features in her face again, softer now. Not angry. Not broken. Whole. He stepped forward, unsure if he was facing a god, a ghost, or an old friend. "You remember me," he said quietly. Her voice was the sound of rain on dry leaves. "I remember everything." The silence that followed the fall of Outpost Theta was unlike anything Earth had known in centuries. It was not the absence of sound but the presence of stillness, the kind that filled every crack of the world, as if the planet itself had taken a long, deep breath. The Reaper stood at the edge of what remained, not as a conqueror, not as a specter of vengeance, but as a guardian restored. All around her, the jungle pulsed with slow, steady life. Trees once scorched by alien fire had healed, their leaves brighter than before. Ruined buildings had been overtaken by moss and flowering vines, transformed into monuments of what was and what must never be again. Nevin wandered through the ruins, hands brushing the flora that grew taller by the day. He no longer feared the vines that curled around his boots or the spores that glittered in the air. He was a guest now, a tolerated remnant of a species that had long overstayed its welcome. The Reaper had spared him not out of mercy, but because he remembered. Because he had once believed in her before she became myth. He often sat near the place where she emerged each dusk, where her glowing form moved among trees like the flicker of memory. She did not speak often anymore. Words, it seemed, were too small now. Far above the Earth, on the outer edge of the galaxy, a different kind of silence fell over the League of Planetary Generals. The last transmission from Earth, a single encrypted file, played in a chamber of frightened dignitaries and trembling commanders. The footage showed no war machines, no battles, no captured enemy. It was a forest, swaying gently under a green-hued sky. In the center of the screen stood a tree larger than any seen before, its bark glowing faintly, its roots spreading into ancient cities now reclaimed. At its base stood the Reaper. She looked into the camera, expression unreadable, and then she smiled, not a cruel smile, not a triumphant one. A knowing smile, like a storm watching ships from the horizon. The transmission ended with a simple phrase spoken in dozens of languages at once. "Do not return." Panic swept through the Galactic Council. Earth, once written off as a lost asset, was now marked as a red zone of the highest order. Quarantine not because it was toxic or lawless, but because it had evolved beyond control. Any attempt to reconquer or exploit it would be considered an act of ecological suicide. Already, rumors began to spread. Smugglers whispered of green ships seen drifting through asteroid fields. Scholars debated whether Earth had become a living consciousness, a singular planetary mind. Children on distant moons were told cautionary bedtime stories of the Verdant Reaper who punished greed and fed on hubris. But while the galaxy gossiped and feared, Earth healed. In the flooded remnants of Venice, fish returned to streets now submerged in lily-covered silence. Bioluminescent jelly trees glowed in old cathedrals where stained glass reflected petals instead of saints. In the canyons of the American West, roots burrowed deep, restoring aquifers and drawing up ancient water. What had been abandoned by human desperation was now reclaimed by deliberate, patient growth. Cities didn't fall. They were absorbed, softened, reformed. And above them all, the Reaper drifted, a presence that moved through light and leaves, watching, tending, remembering. Nevin began to write. Not to warn, not to plead, but to record. He wrote on bark, in spores, encoded in the movements of roots, messages for whoever might stumble upon the world one day. In one, he described the arrogance of those who thought nature could be categorized, owned, or defeated. In another, he chronicled the rise of the Reaper, not as a villain but as the planet's response to abandonment. He wrote of Nia Rowe, her sacrifice, and the terrible beauty of what she had become. These stories were not stored in databases. They were planted, woven into leaves, whispered into seeds. Earth itself became the archive. Years passed. Or perhaps decades. Time lost its usual shape when the sun rose through layers of floral mist, and set beneath canopies that hummed with life. Nevin grew older, his hair white, his body slow. Yet he felt no fear, no loneliness. The jungle kept him company. He often felt her nearby, watching. Sometimes he dreamed of her standing beside him, unchanged, her bark skin gleaming with dew, her eyes not angry anymore but tired. He would wake with tears in his eyes and the scent of wildflowers in the air. One morning, as the mist curled low and golden over the land, a new sound stirred the forest. A low humming, mechanical and unfamiliar. The trees tilted, listening. The wind stilled. From the clouds, a ship descended, small, worn, clearly civilian. It landed clumsily in a clearing, its thrusters disturbing only the surface moss, which reformed moments after. From the hatch emerged a single figure. Young, curious, covered in travel dust and awe. A scavenger, perhaps. Or a descendant of those who had once left the planet behind. He walked carefully, sensing he was being watched. He stepped over roots with quiet reverence, drawn toward a strange light ahead. In the center of the grove, he found a small sapling, no more than waist high. It glowed faintly. As he knelt beside it, it shifted ever so slightly toward him, as if recognizing something familiar. The air trembled. Then the light expanded, and from the sapling, a figure began to form. She wasn't tall like the legends said. She was slight, almost fragile, with skin like green fire and eyes that shimmered with stormlight. The Reaper reborn. Or perhaps a new sprout from her roots. She looked at the newcomer with a soft smile and raised a hand in greeting. The traveler froze. Then, slowly, he raised his hand too. She spoke, and her voice was not one but many, childlike and ancient, hopeful and heavy. It's your turn now. And from the shadows of the forest, the trees leaned forward. Not to threaten. To listen. To begin again. The young traveler's name was Aaron, though the forest didn't ask for it. He had grown up in a tin shelter on a dust moon where the sky never changed, where food came from tubes and dreams came from recycled entertainment. Earth had been a ghost to his generation, a cautionary fable about greed and decay. But something had drawn him here, something in the scattered fragments of old broadcasts, in the whispers of traders who spoke of a green planet that shimmered like a jewel and killed like a god. He hadn't come to conquer, or even to explore. He came because he wanted to know if the stories were true. What he found was not what he expected. The figure standing before him was smaller than the legends suggested, but her presence was enormous. She didn't tower. She emanated. She was part of everything around her, the roots beneath the soil, the wind threading through the trees, the sunlight caught in leaves. Her hair was made of thin vines, her eyes soft and endless. When she had first spoken, Aaron felt it in his chest more than in his ears. A pressure that resonated with something he hadn't known was waiting. "It's your turn now." He had no idea what she meant, but something deep inside him responded. He didn't speak. Instead, he knelt and placed a hand on the ground. It felt warm, not like heated stone, but like skin and breath. The soil pulsed faintly beneath his fingers. The Reaper, or whatever new form she had taken, stepped closer and touched his shoulder. Her hand was cool and strong, not bark, not flesh, but something in between. When her fingers made contact, a wave of memory crashed into him. He saw the earth before the reclaiming, gray skies, empty cities, oceans choked with waste. Then he saw the moment of awakening, when the forests rose in anger and in grief, when roots tore through steel and flowers bloomed in the mouths of war machines. He saw the generals fall. He saw the Reaper emerge, not as a monster, but as a memory-given form, a consequence made real. Then he saw silence, years of growth, of balance, of waiting. Waiting for someone to come without violence in their heart. When the vision ended, Aaron was crying. He didn't know why. Maybe because he had seen the world both die and be reborn in a single breath. Maybe because, for the first time in his life, he felt small in a way that wasn't shameful. She knelt beside him. She didn't ask him to fix anything. She didn't ask him to worship her or kneel. She simply looked at him, waiting. "What do you want from me?" Aaron asked finally. Her answer came not in words but in sensation. The way a forest waits for rain. The way the earth holds seeds until the right time. She wanted him to be part of it. Not as a ruler or a savior, but as a steward. A listener. Someone who would help write the next chapter instead of repeating the old ones. He nodded slowly. Not because he understood everything, but because he felt that understanding would come with time, like roots growing through stone. From that moment, the forest began to change again. Not violently. Gently. Where once it had hardened against the invaders, now it softened in welcome. New paths opened, walkways grown from living wood, bridges spun by moss and time. Aaron was guided deeper into the heart of the green, where machines and nature had fused in impossible harmony. He saw lights powered by bioluminescent pods, water purified by flower filters, entire dwellings shaped from trees that bent to the will of their occupants. It was not a return to the old earth. It was something new. He became the first human in generations to be accepted by the planet, not as an intruder but as kin. The animals watched him without fear. The winds sang his name. The Reaper visited him each night in different forms, sometimes a woman, sometimes a tree, once even a glowing cloud that floated beside him humming ancient melodies. He asked her questions, and she answered only when necessary. Her silence was its own kind of wisdom. In time, more came. Not many. A scattered few. Refugees from cold moons, engineers seeking redemption, artists who had lost their colors in sterile colonies. They came with caution, but when they met Aaron and saw how the jungle embraced him, they let their fear melt. The Reaper tested each of them. Some she allowed to stay. Others she turned away, not with force, but with a gentle whisper that led them elsewhere. This was no longer a world to be taken. It was a world that chose. Among those who stayed, communities formed, small, quiet, respectful of the balance around them. No cities were built. No towers raised. Instead, they grew with the forest, asking permission before cutting a branch, singing to the soil before planting seeds. Children were taught not just arithmetic and language, but how to read the emotions of plants, how to recognize the grief of the rivers and the joy of blooming moss. Aaron became something between a guide and a ghost story, a living link to the time before peace, the boy who had spoken with the Reaper and returned whole. As decades passed, stories became songs, and songs became myths. The Reaper no longer needed to appear. Her presence was everywhere, in the blooming patterns of flowers, in the seasonal shifting of wind, in the quiet miracle of a tree choosing to lean just slightly closer to a child who had whispered to it. She had not disappeared. She had dissolved into the world she had saved. Aaron grew old beneath her watchful eyes. He didn't fear death. He knew it would not be an end. When his time came, he lay beneath the great canopy, the same one where he had first met her, and closed his eyes with a smile. The next morning, in his place, a tree began to grow. Its bark bore faint patterns, like the lines of a palm, and its leaves whispered songs in a voice that sometimes sounded like his own. The galaxy never returned. Not because it couldn't, but because it no longer dared. Earth had become legend. Some called it the Green Grave, others the planet of the Reaper. A few believed it had disappeared entirely, hidden by its own will. But somewhere, floating in the void, there were always whispers of a blue-green world where the forest had memory, where roots spoke with the voice of justice, and where a new civilization grew not from conquest, but from care. And beneath the canopy, deep in the heart of the world, the Reaper dreamed. Not of revenge. Not of loss. But of a future so quiet and steady that it could only belong to the earth.